welcome back to our show. We'll continue our discussion with Mr. Jeffrey Mindich on the English education and the accessibility of English language in Taiwan. Jeffrey, you've been a long advocate of English language here in Taiwan, but also I think more than just language, there needs to be some breakthrough in terms of the cultural barriers that we see in different civilizations, different countries. Do you see that happening in Taiwan? What are the ways that we can help to not only making English more accessible to the people here, but make sure that we have the cultural connection as well to support the language use?
Well, I think you bring up an important point there. Basically, language is a communication tool.
Yes.
It's a communication tool, but it's not actual communication. Mm-hmm. And there is a wide gap between being able to speak a similar language and being able to communicate. Very often people think, well, once I can speak English, I can
communicate.
I'm going to be able to communicate completely with foreigners, or even a foreigner who thinks if I speak Chinese, then I'll be able to communicate completely with local people. You have the tool there, but that's not the only prerequisite for communication. Of course, the famous sociologist Edward Hall, he talked about, so-called high context and low context societies and the different ways that different societies express things. We know that in Asian cultures, people are much more contained, reluctant to express their feelings, and very often you kind of have to guess or have some sense within the context of whether they're saying no, they mean no, or whether they're saying yes, they mean yes. Whereas if you look at Western cultures, and in the Western cultures, I think German is considered one of the most low context. What they mean by low context is that you don't really need to look at the context in which people are talking. What they say
is what
they mean, and that can be very, very confusing, and it can be also awkward because maybe Taiwanese people, when they meet a foreigner, will find, oh, this person is very rude and blunt and straightforward, but that's really the culture. And I have to admit, it's people have said my Mandarin skills are native. However, I still feel that there's aspects of my own culture that are inbred in you that you can never get away from. So, as an example, when you go to a restaurant in the States and the waiter or waitress comes over and says, "How is everything?" The expectation is that if you have any problem, you would tell them, well, this isn't so good or that isn't so good. But when a waiter or waitress comes over in Taiwan and says, "How is everything?" It's just a courtesy. It's really, they really don't expect to hear, "Oh, I have some problem with this," or "I have some problem with that." And it's hard, I used to have a newspaper column in Taiwan in the China Times in Chinese, where I talked about cultural differences, and I talked about the fact how if you're in a restaurant here and maybe you order one dish but they bring you something else, and when you say this isn't what I ordered, well, they say, "Geez, we're sorry about that," and they walk away. Whereas in the state,
they will bring it back.
They would expect to bring it back and change it. So, and also, here people are more reserved about expressing their feelings, and I don't think it's right. I think the first thing you have to realize when you deal with cultures is there's no wrong or right. There's only different.
That's right.
People here do things
differently. There's no better or worse, no superior or inferior. Yes.
I think that's the first step on the way to being a world citizen. Is not to say, hey, my culture is the right way, yours, and people don't do it, other people don't do it the right way. Once you can say, hey, we're all different, and there is no right or wrong, we're just different, I think then you start to be able to form a basis for communication. And I've moderated my Western culture somewhat for the local
bicultural product.
I try, and there's still some times where, though, even it's hard, and because it's something. I wouldn't say it's not only in your upbringing. I don't know. Maybe it's even genetic.
Yes.
Maybe it's even genetic. Some of these cultural things.
And you also have some factors around. People around you, your family, your friends, sort of facilitate. Help to forge that type of behavior. What you said earlier, Jeffrey, is also very evident in my line of work. I'm an advisor, consultant with a lot of businesses in Taiwan. Sometimes you bring the parties together. you're the third-party consultant. You're trying to get down to the bottom line, the price, before a deal is consummated, right? But the two sides will never be straightforward as to how much I want to buy, how much I want to sell. So that is, I suppose people will call that art. It's the process.
The art, a process of negotiation. But even like in companies, you talk about companies.
Yes.
Maybe you have a Western boss and local employees, or vice versa, and there's always seems to be a friction there because Western bosses deal with employees differently than Taiwanese bosses deal, and there's different expectations there, and that's something I think all companies should have. I don't care whether they're in Taiwan or they're in the U.S. or in Europe. If you have a multicultural employee base, you should be having some sort of training for your whole company on how do you deal with cross-cultural issues, because they're bound to come up. They've got to come up.
To forge a better team spirit. And also, Jeffrey, you walk down the streets in Taiwan, particularly in Taipei, you see a lot of Western influences in our contemporary culture. You talk about HBO on television. Right. Certainly you talk about the fast food restaurant chains in Taiwan. We have a number of them. Do you think that's helping Taiwan in terms of breaking that cultural barriers that you and I have been discussing about? You get to know what kind of foods the Americans eat, the Europeans eat, and then what kind of programs they watch, or what are their concerns over contemporary issues and matters. Would that help to break the barrier?
I think to a degree it does. I mean, I think also you have to be realistic. I mean, people watch HBO in the U.S. and they realize that actually real people don't live like that. It's only a movie. So you could get misled into thinking, what I see on HBO, that's the way
really the American way of
Westerners
life.
That's not always the case. But I certainly think I really meant it when I said I think in the last decade or so, Taiwanese, especially urban Taiwanese, have become much more sophisticated, much more global, and you can see that in the way they travel and the way they express themselves. So I think there has been a mix of culture here. You still see Taiwanese culture. I mean, people celebrate their holidays, but you can probably go like for a bowl of Taiwanese-style noodles and then walk across the street and have a Starbucks. So it's there seems to be a mixture going on, and I think that's good. I don't think there's any problem with that, and I think you're seeing that actually the world over, and the more advanced countries become, I think the more you see that mixture of Western and their own native.
I also think that Taiwanese are very good in terms of adapting to different circumstances. You're talking about Starbucks. Starbucks is certainly doing well in Taiwan among other places, but also we have local version of the Starbucks. I won't name the name, name the brand, but certainly that has been doing very well in terms of celebrating just now recently the 2000th store around the island. So that is also like the coffee culture breaking into Taiwan, although coffee is not traditionally part of the
Taiwanese drinks.
Yeah, exactly. And in terms of the government's continued effort, for example, Jeffrey, to try to make Taiwan more internationally in tuned and oriented. Certainly, we have a president who's Harvard educated and speaks very well, very good English.
Right.
And what would be your suggestion as a American living in Taiwan for over 20 years?
Well, again, I think the two biggest suggestions I have is one, to quickly make English a second official language of the country.
Okay.
And number two, I really think there needs to be an increase in the amount of locally produced international English language programs, because there's a big difference between watching CNN and BBC or watching something that's been done locally in English with this particular audience in mind. So
go ahead.
I think from that point of view, both of those, maybe a 24-hour English language station channel, and it could discuss. I mean, there's a lot about Taiwan that also not only would it help people here to become international, it would help the world to understand more about Taiwan. In other words, what if you did programs on Taiwan's technology, Taiwan's medicine, which is quite advanced, and you were actually to sell these programs overseas? It would bring recognition overseas of what Taiwan is doing here.
And also the fact is, of course, going back to the topic of international politics, which certainly hasn't been that visible internationally in the last 2 decades or 3 decades or so. And making Taiwan more internationally in tune certainly has been a concerted government policy for the last 5, 10, 15 years. And then in addition to the 2 suggestions that you made, and what are the other things that you think the audience back home, the viewers back home, they can do on their own to make themselves better prepared for the day when they do become more of an international citizen, more of an international participant, not only in terms of politics, economy, but also in terms of social, cultural movements?
Well, I think to be able to interact with Western culture, whether it's through broader reading, it seems to me people in Taiwan spend a lot of their time watching the same news over and over.
We have a lot of 24-hour
news channels, but to keep watching the same news over and over, it doesn't really do anything to enrich you as a global citizen. I think people need to, if I had to say one thing, I really get a sense that Taiwan people really aren't that interested in global events. And my basis for saying that is you turn on any of the news stations here, outside of, say, CNN and BBC, you turn on any of the local news stations, and you can virtually see no global news. Very limited global news. I think people here need to start to take more of an interest in what's happening around the world in general. I mean, obviously, people everywhere are concerned about what's happening at home, but I think to really be ready to step onto the global stage, you need to know what's happening in the world. And I think people here tend to somewhat avoid news or information about the outside. And I think that's something that could possibly have some room for improvement.
Yeah, Jeffrey, like you mentioned, it should be a two-way traffic. We bring the world into Taiwan, also bring Taiwan out to the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let people know what's happening here on the island. After we come back, we're going to talk about something a little more, relaxed. We're going to talk about food, other things that Jeffrey prefers in life when we come back to the Taiwan Island.